Hello and welcome back to the Publisher Podcast from Media Voices. I'm Esther Thorpe, and in this podcast, Chris Sutcliffe, Peter Houston and I are exploring the people and products powering publishing, both through the podcast and our adjacent weekly newsletter, which you can sign up for at voices.media. We're really pleased to have Memberful as sponsors for this season of the Publisher Podcast. Memberful are a powerful membership solution for publishers and journalists who want to diversify their revenue stream beyond just advertising and brand partnerships. Take control of your publishing business this new year with Memberful. Visit memberful.com/publisherpod. That's memberful.com/publisherpod to get started with a free trial. So we're kicking off this season by talking to Jim Bilton, Managing Director at Wessenden Marketing and Brandlab Research. So Jim produces bi-monthly research and updates on the business of content distribution from WessendenBriefing, and he has decades of experience consulting for media businesses. So we thought it would be great to kick off the year with a look at the standout trends from 2024, what publishers are investing in this year, and how optimistic we're all feeling. I started by asking Jim about his role at Wessenden Marketing and what sort of things he covers.
I'm the founder and managing director of Wessenden Marketing. That is a marketing research advisory firm. We've also got Brandlab, which is a specialist research agency that focuses on the buying decision, how and why people buy. And what spins off from all that are a number of products. WessendenBriefing is our alternate monthly newsletter, which zooms in on consumer mainly, but on the business models that sit behind how people get their content to the audience. But we've also got some bigger ongoing projects. There's the annual Media Futures benchmarking survey, and we also do something called Media Shapers. Media Shapers is slightly more off the wall, but where we ask people who work inside the media business who they think the key individuals are who are shaping the industry. So we do that on an annual basis. We extended it last year, just at the end of the year, to cover businesses and brands, and we may get onto that later on as to who the key movers and shakers are in our business. But that's a quick overview as to what we actually do.
Wasn't that the one Elon Musk came out as top, quite depressingly?
Yeah, Elon Musk and Trump.
Oh, great.
The main polling took place before the results of the presidential election. So it's come back with absolute horror. I mean, there's an interesting issue that comes out of that, and an interesting quote about a number of people saying that we as the media bear some responsibility for the monsters we've partially created, because they sell newspapers, they get traffic on sites. So we've got this weird love-hate relationship with both Trump and Musk, who could destroy us both in different ways.
So as part of those bi-monthly reports you do, what are some of the standout trends you noticed in 2024 from those surveys, especially when it comes to sort of publisher products, where publishers are investing, and perhaps where some of the growth is?
I think 2024 was an absolute blur of activity. In terms of what people are doing, I don't think there are any particularly new things that are out there. It's that people, the product mix, the platform mix is shifting, and by brand. I think the whole fragmentation piece has accelerated tremendously. And also, when we're talking about any particular issue, whether it's AI, and I suppose we are going to get onto AI, but from AI through to any other sort of development and routes to market, it varies a lot by product category. So I think a lot of the coverage is about newspapers, and I think newspapers have a very different future to magazines. So you've got dailies, you've got regionals, you've got the weekly titles, which are this sort of crossover area. Then you get into magazines, so weeklies, monthlies, bookazines and one-shots, which then overlap with books. So each one of those in pure supply chain, whether it's a digital supply chain or a print supply chain, have got very different pulse rates and different requirements. And I think news has hijacked the agenda, whereas there's a lot more and a lot more positive stuff going on in what we used to call the magazine business.
What is a bookazine? Because I keep hearing this term come up, and I'm assuming it's like a mash between like a book and a magazine. But at what point is a book a magazine and a magazine a bookazine? And
well, again, this is fragmenting as to what a bookazine was, and this goes back 20, 30 years.
A bit before my time, Jim.
Yeah, so not before mine, sadly, but we used to call them one-shots. So they were higher priced, but sometimes they were of reusing what we call evergreen, but reusing all the old material in a product that was a literal one shot. You've now got sort of hybrids where you get one shots appearing under an overall brand name. But the basic concept is still the same, that it doesn't have, or it has a longer on sale period than a regular frequency title, and you start pushing the price up, and some of them are getting thicker and thicker in terms of pagination and quality of paper as to how high you actually go. There is the old sort of £9.99, £10 threshold. But books are going through the same thing. I mean, between hardbacks and paperbacks, they're getting up to £20, £30 hardbacks. So everybody is flexing with pricing and quality and paginations to see what it is people actually want.
I'm going to exclude newspapers from this because their trajectory seems to be down, and there doesn't seem to be much of a way out of this. But we're at the point now where a lot of people have forecast that tablet reading would take over, everybody would have Kindles and be reading books digitally, and magazines as well. But there seems to be a bit of a backlash to that, which is driving this sort of print revival, whether that's books, bookazines, magazines. Why do you think there is such a positive growth trajectory there, where newspapers are still just going downhill and really, really struggling, despite the magazine and maybe less frequent print product stuff is actually doing quite well?
Yeah, I think it's very much the experience. I mean, a daily newspaper and even a newspaper website is up against so much free content that's available via other means, and throw in conversational search as well. And that is hitting the newspaper business. I mean, newspaper business, they've all got very different business models. And even within the same company, the Sun has got a very different business model to the Times. But what seems to be coming out of it is that weekly is a good analysis frequency. And you look at things like The Economist, The Spectator, The Week, which is one of my favourites. So weekly frequency is a good one for news, but also what we mean by digital with news is very different to magazines. Magazines are still coming from a digital edition base when we talk about digital. The newspapers are website based, article level. So they've unbundled the article, which is another big sort of philosophical issue with magazines, as to whether you start unbundling it. And I think Readly is an interesting example of all these things coming together, of unbundling the magazine into articles, of using podcasts and audio and text to speech. I quite like actually speech to text. I'm not a great podcast listener, I'll own up to. But I think, so newspapers and magazines have got very different competition and are coming at it and will end up in different places.
But even within the daily newspaper, there's still these diverging trends where you've got the Evening Standard, which is a free daily in London. I think have they gone weekly, or that they've stopped their print edition and gone weekly.
Yes, they have. Yes. Yeah.
But then Metro, which is a free morning daily in London, is doing really well, and they've had a smashing year. And is that not the same proposition?
Again, the Metro success is a lot of it is cost cutting, of ripping cost out, of sharing editorial. So they've got onto a firmer financial basis partly by doing that. But I think there is still a need for, or a demand for, rather, for weekly analysis. And of standing back and having some curated, independent, so it comes back to trust and all those kind of issues. There's a really interesting case study brewing with Tortoise and the Observer as to what on earth they're going to do with the Observer. To have a weekly print publication that summarizes the news, why come out on a Sunday? The Guardian has got Guardian Weekly, which it's reviving. So Spectator Week, Guardian Weekly are Fridays. So the data is there on a Friday to be read over the weekend. Tortoise is say another interesting one, perhaps we'll come on to later on newsletters and going from text into audio and podcasting. And we'll see what comes out of that. But that sort of weekly frequency to analyse what is going on is very much where I think newspapers are coming from and will end up. Going back to print and the print revival, what is utterly perplexing is book talk. So you use TikTok. That sells a lot of back inventory of people's print books, or it may be print on demand through Amazon. But you've got this weird crossover where people like Barnes & Noble, Waterstones have got TikTok tables. So things that have been featured on Book Talk, and also that TikTok has gone into book publishing and print book publishing. So books are different again, but they're similar to bookazines. There is still this desire for print consumption, almost as if that's the real thing, but also it's some of it's coffee table. You stick it on your coffee table and don't actually read it. Some of it is, and some of the smaller artisan magazines are absolute passion publishing. Some of them publishing only a few hundred copies per issue, but where you can charge sometimes £150 for a single product. It's mad. The world's gone mad.
Book Talk, £150 magazines, we're definitely in the end times. Yes. This is quite a difficult general question, but if you're let's say a magazine publisher, maybe there was once a print magazine or you're looking to launch a print magazine, is this print revival a bit of a flash in the pan, or is this something you can actually see being part of a sustainable strategy for the future?
I think it is a medium-term strategy. Print has flicked over to be a premium add-on, and it's very interesting to see brands which have gone digital only and coming back into print. People like NME, Jackie, the brand is being revived, and very often it has this premium added value experiential element to it. So I think that will continue certainly in the medium term.
So you mentioned newsletters earlier, and I know your last few briefings have identified them as a bright spot for publishers. There are some promising startups showing real results. I think our listeners all know people like Mill Media. Do you think this is sustainable going into 2025 and beyond, or could we see a bit of a popping of that newsletter bubble?
Not necessarily a popping of the bubble. I think everybody thinks that newsletters are the answer to everything. And I think if you look longer term back, as someone like the Telegraph, who had, I think, up to 16 different newsletters and then streamlined them. So I think we'll go through that cyclical process of building up newsletter activity, newsletter content, until you get to a point where there's simply too much content. So you're back into the old problem of delivering too much content, and the streamlining, repackaging, rebundling. And the Economist is constantly doing it with Espresso. So we have a number of different entry points into our content. At one extreme is the weekly print publication, which is a fairly long and hefty read. And they've been experimenting with different apps and newsletters. And I think it's this cyclical of trying to identify, well, it comes back to what do the readers actually want? What do the end users actually want? And defining your cohorts, ultimately going one-to-one, although whether that's an absolute pipe dream, but at least to do it by cohorts. And so we've got a range of newsletters that fit particular cohorts. And some of those cohorts may still like print, but want information coming through, but perhaps also the flexibility to turn it up and turn it down. So that's a long and rambling answer to say it's not a bubble that's bursting, but I think the smarter operators are constantly flexing their newsletter portfolio. But it clearly, in certain markets like regional newspapers and hyperlocal and building from the bottom up, that's very much newsletter based. And you've mentioned Mill Media and Josh Herriman. And there are a lot of journalists, mainly journalists who have fallen out of the national newspapers, who are substacking or doing all kinds of different things. But it comes back to the whole fragmentation of the media business and individuals and influencers versus publishing organisations.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to see that you've got it as well with people like Michael McLeod, who've done the Edinburgh Minute and the London Minute. And I think if you told me 5 years ago that people would be paying for regional newsletters in their inbox, my eyebrows would have shot up. But it seems that they are actually being accepted by consumers as a product that they pay for, rather than just another email in their inbox, which is quite interesting.
It is. I mean, a hyper-local is and I think why the Mill is interesting is I think they're the only ones who are building sufficient scale. But a lot of it, particularly perhaps partly because they're journalists who are setting them up, who like the idea of paid for content, but it needs some kind of funding. It needs advertising at some stage, or at least sponsorship from and it seems to be the model, seems to sponsorship from local businesses. So there's a completely different business model. Whether how many of them actually survive is going to be really interesting to see. And I think the jury is out on most of the activity.
In the final episode of the year we did last year, one of the predictions Peter came up with was that maybe the mix of 6 that we've gone on about may actually be too many revenue streams when it comes to diversification. What do you think publishers should be aiming for? Like, is 6 too much? Is 2 too few? Is that like a happy medium?
Well, that is the question. And there's an interesting piece of research which I think you referenced from FT Strategies.
Yeah.
Now, again, it's their definition. I think they say they define a revenue stream as something that accounts for at least 15% of total turnover. So you're talking about some fairly big stuff, but they've done some analysis, mainly on newspapers rather than on other sort of magazine lifestyle product. Of 3, that's the optimum. Go too far beyond that, and you start running into trouble. I think PPA a couple of years ago came up with sort of 5 platforms as being and revenue streams as being for their membership, the average kind of number. But I don't think there's a definitive answer to that. They raise a number of points. The first is that revenue diversification is a given. We all have to do it, but it isn't an end in itself, that it's what the end users, the end consumers actually want, which I know we pay as an industry a lot of lip service to that, but I don't think I think we still essentially push organizations that we've got stuff that we want to push out rather than really having a proper two-way conversation. Do they make money? No profit. If they don't, why are we doing it? But I think it is. We need to go through the business case as to why we are actually doing that and prioritizing it. And that depends on the organization, because I think most people's list of things they would like to do is far too long to maintain quality all the way through. I mean, I've got when talking to publishers, a very simple approach, which is stop, start, continue. And the old one in, one out. If you're going to introduce a new revenue stream, what are you going to stop? Because you can't do all of this at the same time. So that's the stop-start element of it. But there's also continue. The reality is what you're doing at the moment, and some of it may be in print, is actually paying for these new revenue streams. So understanding what works now and why it might not work in 1 year, 2 years time, but can we extend that runway? So that's a recurring conversation on stop, start, and continue.
Okay.
But I think that there are a number of basic principles about it all, about not over-engineering it, starting quickly and small. What does good look like? We leap into all kinds of things. Some bright spark thinks is a good idea and may feel as though it's a natural extension. But what does it look like? Because at some stage we're going to have to tweak it or kill it quickly. So acting quickly, doing it at relatively small scale, but also, and it's a beef of mine, is of record and learn and remember, because the same things come around. I mean, I've been around long enough in the business to see stuff that came up 30, 40 years ago that's coming back in a different format, but they're the same issues about delivering content, and that we're in danger of losing the lessons from the past, which something that didn't work 10 years ago may work now because of AI, because of digital tools. But it's of constantly experimenting, but experimenting at a speed that we've never known before.
That's interesting. One of the things I've seen a lot when I talk to people is they try something, they give it 3 months, and then it's not worked, so they kill it. And you say to them, okay, what marketing did you do around that? How much did you tell people about it? I'm thinking particularly podcasts and newsletters, and to a certain extent, any print launches. And they just expect it to have taken off, which is not how any other product in any industry works. I've just noticed there is always a severe mismatch between the products publishers are putting out, which for the most part are pretty good, and the marketing budget they put behind it to actually tell people about it. I don't know if that's something you've sort of seen as well, but if people are going to experiment quickly and only give it a couple of months, you need to have a marketing bang behind that as well, because if people don't know about it, they're not going to use it.
Yeah. I mean, there are sort of behind all this, there are some serious judgment calls, normally from senior management, to say we're going to persevere with this. We haven't got it right, but we've got to tweak the variables. But you've touched on the main one. That if you think you've come up with the perfect product, that it's immediately going to sell or catch people's attention. But these are, the old print launch used to say, it took 2 years to really establish itself, 5 years to break even. That these were longer term plays, that in our obsession about having speedy and quick answers, so we'll close it, got to move on. It takes more patience, but also more money to do that, and a commitment to invest.
I can't remember who I was talking about podcasts, but they said that you needed to put for your podcast budget, about 30% of it towards actually marketing to tell people you got one.
Right. Yes. Yeah. Well, I mean, you're in this situation at the moment with Media Voices, aren't you? In terms of altering your business model and finding out what actually works, because you've sort of talked about the podcast, the decline in listening numbers, and changing the frequency of the newsletter. Fiddling around with that has all kinds of knock-on effects.
It has. I think what we find difficult is there's a lot we'd like to do and we get distracted. We think, oh, that's great, we could do that, we could launch that, and people say, oh, we love the daily newsletter, and it's like, well, you might have done, but it actually wasn't good for us. So sometimes it's not blocking out user feedback, because user feedback is very important, but it's sometimes killing your darlings in order to get to a more sustainable place in the future. And maybe, I think things that people are quite fond of, saying, yes, I know you love it, but actually that doesn't fit into a new strategy. And that, I can imagine if you're a much more established or bigger publisher, those are really difficult calls to make. It feels strange it's now 2025 to be making business decisions based on gut instinct when you feel like you should have data in this day and age to support your decisions. But the reality is you don't, and sometimes you just have to make those gut decisions and hope that the results will follow through and prove that right.
Well, it's really perplexing, because one of my key metrics is lifetime value. But lifetime value, you need a lot of patience for the data, and depending on your publishing frequency or what you've actually done, there, in order to start to get hard data, you've got to wait quite a bit of time. Otherwise, so I think a lot of people are sort of bifocal of saying we're going to capture this data and we'll look at it, but in the short term we've got to make quick decisions.
I think there's a really good example of this. I was actually speaking to somebody this week about that they've launched an app for their title, and apps are obviously quite expensive. They're a big investment, and they said that what we've seen over the last few decades is people making very short-term decisions on things like ROI, what they're investing in. And they said that this is actually a longer-term decision, because they know that apps will increase retention of their subscribers incrementally. And over 10, 15, 20 years, that will really pay back. But in the short term, there's quite a big hit, and they've accepted that that's an investment that they're making, and it's a very long-term thing. A lot of publishers don't take that really long-term view into consideration.
Yes, yeah. And you look at outside our business of people like Netflix and Spotify on pure music streaming, on the royalty structure, is structurally incapable of making a consistent profit. So they've gone down the podcast route, probably overspent immensely on building their in-house studio capability, but buying in big names. So the figures look a bit better. Or Netflix getting into gaming, which has got completely different financial dynamics. And some of these companies, so what I call the legacy digital, it's odd to think of Netflix and Spotify as legacy companies, but in a sense they are. And they're hitting the same revenue diversification, but they're prepared to take some big, long-term, and probably quite mixed, successful disasters along the way.
Yeah. So we've touched on quite a few publishers in this episode. I don't know if there are any that you think are particularly standing out in terms of doing really interesting things in this space, or that are ones to watch particularly this year.
Going back to the Media Shapers survey, we asked people to identify individuals, but also brands and companies. So it's very interesting. It's very different moving from sector to sector. What is clear is that B2B is still in the lead. It's still a lot smarter than consumer. In B2B, the names that came up, three interesting names: Informa, William Reed, and Royal College of Nursing. as three very different operations.
Not the sexiest operators, though,
No,
right?
no, indeed not. Indeed not. There is a theme there also about live events, and going back to saying about revenue diversification and which are the hot ones. And clearly, live events is making a comeback with different business models to what they were pre-pandemic. And the whole range, but consumer is particularly picking up on live events and awards, live experiences, as well as getting into other platforms, getting into video and audio and e-commerce, although e-commerce very few people have got right, and people have lost their shirts in doing e-commerce. But live events is an interesting one that's coming back, which sort of drives the B2B consumer. So the consumer respondents, clearly that general lifestyle is under more threat than specialist sectors, and also there's more of a crossover between B2B with marketplaces and e-commerce activity, so between what B2B do and consumer do. There were three companies that came out in that: Future, Hearst and Bauer. Future because they've gone off the boil and presumably are about to get rid of their magazine operation either in one lump or in bits and pieces. Hearst is an interesting one, going down the membership route and what they're going to do with Good Housekeeping, or are doing with Good Housekeeping Institute, which should send shivers down the spine of which. So there's an interesting operation there. And Bauer, who are reshaping and refocusing on their new vertical business units. So they've moved away from the old, we're going to be the last man standing in print operation, which led them into absolute disasters, particularly in Australia. But with radio and e-commerce, they're reckoned to be a very smart consumer operation. And then brands, you've got Vogue, which is, I suppose, the ultimate crossover B2B consumer brand. Wired and National Geographic. Time Out, which has reinvented itself as a curated food experiences through their food halls, but are using their media know-how and their books to develop that model, which seems to be coming together.
I think all of those brands you've mentioned are all legacy.
Yes.
There's definitely none of the younger upstarts in there.
No. I mean, you get things, if they're going on to news, Politico, but yeah, they are. I think we're still preoccupied with the big brands, and interesting to see how you turn a brand or adapt a brand for a multi-platform, very fast-changing audience.
It's interesting that Hearst. Could you just clarify for those that don't know what they're doing with their Good Housekeeping?
Well, so the Good Housekeeping Institute rates products in the way that Which do, but they're extending the range of products that they test and give the Good Housekeeping Institute seal of approval to. So it is to engage the audience, so the users and the readers, more in a subscription-based operation, whether you bundle that into an overall Good Housekeeping package or it's something that's separate. But on being a bit smarter in commercializing the products that they recommend, which is what, Which is doing all those things, but it's just finding it's getting a competitor, a direct competitor with a very big brand and loyalty across a surprisingly wide age range, and also male as well as female, but still predominantly female.
What opportunities do you think publishers should be paying attention to at the moment that you think they might be missing or underinvesting in?
The big investment areas are still and have been consistent over the last few years from the Media Futures survey are tech stacks and people. And people becoming increasingly expensive, knowing what skills that the organization actually needs. And do you outsource it? Do you retrain existing people? Do you bring new people in? And generally, they're younger and more digital and, in brackets, cheaper than some of the older, more experienced executives within an organization. But the enabler of everything is tech stacks. And that's where I think the investment is going, that's the smarter operators. But again, going back to an earlier part of the conversation about length of time, that the people who are delivering some really interesting stuff at the moment have been investing in tech for 2 or 3 years minimum to come up to where they are at the moment. So there are these long-term investments which, if you can afford them, that's another factor of 2024 is increasingly, when we're looking at and measuring confidence amongst the benchmarking group of publishers and the confidence figures, we ask on a 1 to 10 scale, how confident do you feel about the future of your organization in 12 months and 2 years time, ranging from 3 up to 10. And I think that range has extended and normally the people at 3 are working from month to month on their cash flow in order to survive. The people at 10, I think, are slightly dangerous. I'm more of an 8 man myself.
I want some of what they're having for breakfast.
Yes, exactly. Or whether they're going to nosedive the plane into the runway.
I was going to say, interesting you didn't mention AI, unless that would come under tech stacks.
AI is this... we don't know anything about what's going to happen. And in theory, it offers all kinds of benefits to publishers in terms of producing content, distributing content in a more sophisticated way, more sophisticated personalized marketing, communication and promotion. Yet there still is the existential threat that it can just rip a business apart almost overnight. So there's a lot of investment, and when I mean say investment, it's also time and headspace, and taking the time out to think more strategically rather than just pure money, because again, as with anything, there are people who are spending and probably wasting a lot of money leaping in to make quick decisions about tech stacks. And also, do you buy off the shelf? Do you buy and build? Do you create it yourself? There are all pros and cons to that as well. The other factor I think is interesting when looking at how is 2025 going to be different from 2024. One of the things I think pressure has been building up in the M&A market, that the mergers and acquisitions slowed down. They dropped significantly 2022 to 2023. And certainly in terms of private equity, and that there are people who have been building up significant war chests who it's going to be released in 2025. And some of those deals, perhaps more than AI, will have a more immediate effect on the shape of the landscape as to who your competitors are, what they're actually doing. So I think there's an interesting M&A year ahead for our business. I think collaboration is a big issue on a lot of operations who don't have, a lot of businesses in media who don't have the scale as individual companies and need to, whether it's just basic sharing, back office functions, certainly getting together in terms of promotion, possibly. You come back to the retail supply chain, and I think there needs to be an industry, more of a joined up industry approach for newspapers and magazines to defend its space in retail. And then the big threat that's coming along is retail media. If you're talking about first party data and understanding your own audience, some of the biggest operators are retailers who have massive first-party data and already sucking promotional revenues out of brand spend into their own operations, whether it's in-store, whether it's online, whether it's through newsletters, and with magazines still there as platforms and tools for the major retailers.
Just had to check the year. Supermarket magazines being a threat, like, is this 2010?
Yeah,
it all comes around, doesn't it? It all comes around.
Yes, it does, in a slightly different format. But you come against someone against Tesco with a massive or first-party data-based audience who know so much about what their audience is buying and thinking, and that is a massive, much shorter term than AI threat to our business.
Are publishers optimistic about 2025, and are you?
Yes. Yes. The answer. I'm hopeful, rather than perhaps confident about the future. Confidence, as I've already touched on, within our sample of media futures, and it's a self-selecting sample, so someone who's about to go out of business isn't going to be part of the survey. But even that group, as I said, ranged from 3 out of 10 to 10 out of 10 in terms of their confidence about the future. So I think it's very specific as to what the underlying financials are, and very often that is just the cash flow from day to day that tends to come from legacy activities. So I think publishers are all over the place as to where they actually are, but I think the smarter ones through 2024 have just been chugging away, perhaps quite quietly, at their strategies and are looking. I think everybody was hoping that the economy was going to pick up in 2025. I'm not quite sure what's going to happen with the economy. And just to qualify, I came across a quote which I've tweaked slightly, but it's about attitude and glass half full, glass half empty. It's asking whether the glass is half full or half empty isn't the most important question. That's just a matter of attitude. The core issue is that the glass is clearly the wrong size for the liquid that's in it, which is a structural issue. Finding the optimal glass is the real task for every business. And I think that 2025 is a year where we've got to think really laterally and say, well, why do we do things this way? Retail supply chain. Do we need 38,000 retailers? That's just a legacy. Could we actually do a lot better with 20,000? Which would mean a very different supply chain. And you could apply that to digital output as well. That I think we need to apply our thinking and passion and skills and energy, but think a lot more laterally and strategically than we have done.
Yeah, well, that's why I think some of those startups that are succeeding, particularly sort of the newsletter first ones, are successful because they are so slim and so lean in their operations. They will only take on or expand when they have to, when they can.
Yeah, and they don't pay themselves a salary very often.
As a solo operator yourself, what does 2025 have in store for you?
Well, it's
applying all these lessons.
It's taking my advice, which is to prioritise. That I have got, and particularly over the Christmas period, come back to work with all kinds of things I'd love to do, and I keep having to slap myself and say, you can't do all this, Jim.
One in, one out.
One in, one out, exactly. But I don't want to take anything out.
I know. I feel that one very, very personally. Thank you so much to Jim Bilton for speaking to us. Jim has kindly offered a free sample of the most recent issue of WessendenBriefing, which is a bi-monthly briefing on the business of content distribution to all our listeners. You can drop him a line on info@Wessenden.com and mentioning the Publisher podcast. Now don't forget, we've got a write-up of the key learnings from this interview on voices.media, or dropped into your inbox every Tuesday if you sign up to the publisher newsletter, also on voices.media. This season is sponsored by Memberful, which is a best-in-class membership solution that lets you offer perks and exclusive content to your loyal audience, giving you full control over who has access to your articles, newsletters, podcasts, community chats and more. Find out more and try it for free at memberful.com/publisherpod. We'll be back next week with another dive into the people and products powering publishing's future. Until then, keep up with all things Media Voices by following us on LinkedIn and subscribing to the publisher newsletter over on voices.media. Until next time.